Let's look at fuel switching as an option to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It is the final term in the Chi identity. If we want this term to be negative, if we want our emissions to fall, then we can also play around with this term. That is, we can emit less per unit of energy used. There's a whole bunch of technical options to do so. People typically think of renewables, but we can also think of fuel switching within fossil fuels. If you burn gas to make electricity, you emit around 57 tons of CO2 per terajoule of energy gained, whereas if you burn coal to make electricity, you emit almost twice as much, 95 tons of CO2 per terajoule of energy gained. And this explains partly what we've seen in the United States. If we index the year 2000 to be 100, then CO2 emissions in 2019 were 72. That is, over this 20-year period, emissions fell by 28%. And this is largely because coal use more than halved over this period. Actually, it stayed constant in the beginning and then it halved in a shorter period. And most of the slack was made up by a steep increase in the natural gas use for power generation. The reason for this is twofold. The first is the shale revolution. They figured out how to get shale out of the ground, and as a result, shale gas out of the ground, and as a result, gas prices fell. And it was simply more profitable to burn gas rather than coal to make electricity. And the second reason, because of laws enacted during World War II, it was forbidden to export natural gas. And as a result, gas prices fell very, very steeply. It was never forbidden to export coal, so that is what they did. And some of the coal ended up in Germany, where you see the opposite effect of what was going on in the US. The coal price fell because of the cheap US exports. Gas prices didn't budge because of the export, because exporting gas was forbidden. When they turned down the nuclear power plants in Germany, you see an increase in coal use and you see a reduction in gas use, and CO2 emissions moved the wrong way. CO2 emissions went up. So that's your first option. You can move away from dirty coal towards clean gas. But you can also switch to carbon-free energy sources, and there's a whole bunch of them. There's no physical issues here. There's so much wind and so much solar and so much waves that you can supply the world's energy use 10 times over without a problem. There's also no technical problem here. We know how to harness the power of the wind and the sun and biomass and nuclear and hydro. The problems are either economic or social. But we need to do this. We need to move away from our conventional fossil fuels. This is a complicated graph. First, what is on the vertical axis? Here we have the gaseous fossil fuels, here we have the liquid fossil fuels, and here we have the solid fossil fuels. There's reserves and resources, and the resources come in three gradations. What is a reserve? An energy reserve is something that is in the ground. We know it's in the ground, and we know how to get it out of the ground and sell it at a profit with current technologies. Resources are stuff that we think with future prices or with future technologies we may get it out of the ground profitably, but not at today's prices and today's technologies, and they come in gradations because different resources have different problems, and those gradations are proved probable and possible. And the lighter the gray, the further we need to go out of the current range of technology and prices to make these things profitable. And then the final complication in this graph is the horizontal axis, where the assumption is that we take all this stuff out of the ground and burn it and then see how much CO2 ends up in the atmosphere, or rather by how much does the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere change. Now these numbers don't mean a lot. 100 parts per million is roughly the Paris the targets in the Paris Agreement of 2015. Now those are three messages that come out of this particular graph. One is if we take our conventional oil and our conventional gas and we burn it all, then we don't actually have a very big climate problem. That is one message, and the conventional oil and gas is the gas that comes out of Qatar and Russia, and the oil that comes out of Saudi Arabia and Russia. Can burn it all, not a big climate problem. Second takeaway follows immediately. Well, if we worry about climate change but not about conventional oil and gas, that means that there's actually not a whole lot of conventional oil and gas left. And that is the important message here, that we're running out of conventional oil and gas and we need to find a replacement. And that means that we need to develop the technologies to make these things happen. This is a somewhat older graph, and shale gas is here listed as a proved reserve, and shale oil is listed as a proved reserve here. By now they are proved resource, and by now there are reserves really. We need to develop the technologies to replace running out of conventional fossil fuels, and that is going to require a lot of investment in new technology, but it's also going to completely restructure the geopolitics, because this stuff comes out of the Middle East and Russia, and this stuff comes out of the Middle East and Russia. This stuff doesn't. This comes out of the United States, and this comes out of the United States, and that means that the geopolitics of energy will completely change within the next few decades, completely regardless of climate change. It has nothing to do with climate change and everything to do with resource scarcity. The third message that comes from this graph is that, well, one proven technology, one way that we know we can make energy and power, is to switch back to the solid fossil fuels, coal. We have plenty of coal. We have enormous amounts of coal left in the ground. And it's not just that you can use coal to burn to make electricity, but we also know how to liquefy coal, and then you can drive your car on it, or we know how to gasify coal, and then you can do all sorts of other things with it. And that would lead to an enormous climate problem, because there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of CO2 contained in coal. But the important message here is that we need to change the energy sector anyway. We can switch back to coal, we can move to non-conventional oil and gas, or we can move to carbon-free sources of energy. And there's a whole bunch of them, as I said. Nuclear and hydro are top of the list because they're old and proven technologies. The problem with nuclear and hydro is that they're unpopular and difficult politically, particularly in Europe and the United States and Japan. That has to do with a series of accidents and near accidents, if we're talking about nuclear. And with hydro, the issue is that, if you want a big hydropower plant, you need to build a big reservoir, and that means that you're going to flood a valley, and you're going to evacuate lots of people, and you're going to do a lot of ecological damage, and you're going to make damage heritage and cultural assets. It's simply very difficult to pull this off, and the only ones that are still building nuclear and hydro are fairly authoritarian regimes. But in a democracy, it simply is not an issue. There's another issue with nuclear, and that is proliferation. If you can build a nuclear power plant, then you can also build a dirty bomb, and if you build a nuclear power plant, you also have the materials to build a dirty bomb. Now, that is not so much an issue if we have a responsible and stable government, but if you really want to make a dent in your CO2 emissions by nuclear power plants, by nuclear power, then you don't just need nuclear power plants in sort of stable countries like China, but you will also need a lot of nuclear power plants in places like Pakistan and the Central African Republic. So that is just not a very good option. Um, Wind and solar are other options. Wind and solar used to be more expensive, but they are no longer. Here we're looking at the cost of wind in this graph, and you see it has actually fallen quite a bit. Here we're looking at the cost of solar, which has fallen even steeper. Note that the vertical scale is different here. Here it ends at 215, here it ends at 450. You see just a very steady and rapid decline of wind and solar. Solar is still slightly more expensive than wind, but solar is now also competing with fossil fuels and has been for a while. Of course, these costs are uncertain, and that is why you see different estimates come up with different numbers. And of course, fossil fuels also come in a variety of tastes and in a variety of costs. But what you see here is that the cost of solar has dropped well within the range of the cost of fossil electricity, and in some cases it has actually dropped below the cost. And in some places, solar is now simply the cheapest way of making electricity. That is not to say that these sources of energy have no problems with that. One of the biggest problems with wind is that it's ugly. You need a whole lot of wind turbines, and nobody likes to live near a wind turbine. So visual intrusion is a problem. There's also issues with damage to birds and bats. Working on it, haven't quite solved it. Solar has another problem, and that is that solar panels are essentially chemical waste. They're fine as long as you have them on your roof, but as soon as you take them down, you have a waste problem. There's all sort of nasty chemicals and heavy metals in solar panels. Another problem with both wind and solar is that it's non-dispatchable. Solar has the problem that it doesn't quite work at night. This is for photovoltaics. Concentrated solar power does have momentum and can be carried overnight. And the problem with wind is that sometimes the wind blows and sometimes it doesn't. And you need backup capacity and you need electricity storage. Now, storage is getting cheaper and cheaper, particularly in batteries. So this is a problem that is an issue today, but presumably will not be an issue in 10 or 20 years into the future. Another problem with wind and solar is that the best resources are far from where the people live. So the wind blows the hardest near the seaboard, near the ocean. Most people live a little bit further inland, so you need to transport electricity, and transporting electricity is expensive. And similarly for solar, best solar resources are actually in the desert for two reasons. One, the sun shines pretty hard there. Second, land is cheap, and that makes solar production cheaper. But then, of course, you need to transport the electricity to where the people are. So these technologies are almost there, and in many places they can compete with fossil fuels, but there are still issues. And those will be solved within the next few decades. Another problem with wind and solar is that they make electricity. And electricity is wonderful for many things, but not so wonderful for other things. And the biggest issue still is the transport sector, where it's really a lot better still to have a liquid fuel. Those liquid fuels, there can be carbon neutral liquid fuels as well. They're essentially biomass. The problem with the first generation of biomass is that it's expensive. And essentially what you do in the first generation biomass is you take oil seeds, for instance. Rapeseed is very popular, but you can also take corn and you can turn it into methanol or ethanol, and then you can just stick it in your car. That's absolutely no problem. And the issue is that this stuff is expensive. It is bad for your health. Rapeseed, for instance, causes hay fever. That's one issue. Some of these plants are not particularly good for the animals that live near the fields, and they don't burn so clean, so you have a lot of particulate emissions. And essentially, the stuff that we burn for energy could also be eaten, either directly by humans or by the animals that we then subsequently eat. So there's an immediate competition between the generation of biofuels, the production of biofuels, and food production. And this has led to sharp increases in food prices. At the moment, some 25% of the corn harvest in the US is diverted to ethanol, and that means that tortillas are more expensive in Mexico, and that is actually behind some of the food riots that we have seen over the years. So the first generation of biomass is not very good or not very exciting. But if I say first generation, then it immediately pops into your head that there must also be a second generation, which is of course true, and people are working hard on that. The second generation biomass is essentially processing the plant material in a smarter way. It will never compete with fossil fuels. What are fossil fuels? Fossil fuels are essentially ancient plant material. Ancient plant material that has been transformed and compacted and dried and everything by Mother Nature over centuries and millennia and longer. Biomass is also plant material, but it's recent plant material. And what you need to do is, in order to make it work, you need somebody onto the field to harvest it, and then you need to compact it, and then you need to dry it, and you need to transport it to a processing plant, and then you somehow need to get the oily stuff out of this. And so with fossil fuels, it's the same process, but over millennia done by Mother Nature without an economic transaction or without an economic effort. With biofuels, you have to do everything yourself and quickly. And therefore it's more expensive. And what people are doing is coming up with smarter ways of doing this, smarter processes, better machines, and so on and so forth. But you don't overcome the problem that essentially what you're doing is you simply can't compete with fossil fuels ever, because you're doing all this effort yourself. Now that is the second generation of biomass. There's also a third generation of biomass, and that is best illustrated with brassica. So what we have done over the last 10,000 years or so is optimize our food for, we optimized our plants for food. What you're looking at here is the wild mustard plant. And over a period of a few thousand years, we have, by natural selection, by selective breeding, turned that into carrots and Brussels sprouts and kohlrabi and kale and broccoli and cauliflower. This is all the same plant, but it looks quite different. And this is by selective breeding. And what we have done is completely transform and optimize our food supply by manipulating plants. If you look at the plants that we use for energy, they're still the same. A lot of biofuels is essentially trees chopped up and thrown into what used to be a coal-fired power plant. That's basically it. Or seeds pressed for oil, much like the Romans did. Um, that immediately implies two things. One, because we have not optimized our plants for energy yield. That means that there's enormous progress that can be made. Um, and we don't need thousands of years for that because we are much better at selective breeding than our ancestors were because we understand the plants much better and we can genetically manipulate these plants. So you can expect very rapid technological progress, and that is the third generation of biomass. Very rapid technological progress in the production and generation of biofuels. And we've seen spectacular things come out of the lab. One of my favorites is a form of algae that you throw in a vat of water and you just let it stand for a couple of days, and then you come back and then there's a film of biodiesel on top, and you just scoop it up, you put it in your car and you drive away. There's all sorts of spectacular progress like that. Those things are still in the lab. They haven't been scaled up to trial plants, let alone industrial production. But give it another 10, 15 years, and then we can probably have third generation biomass that can really compete with fossil fuels as well. So all of these things are feasible. We can move to a carbon-free energy supply, and it's just a matter of time before these things happen, because technological progress in the past has been impressive, and there is absolutely no reason why technological progress would stop in the next few decades. Not quite there yet, apart from electricity, where we probably are there yet, but for other uses of fossil fuels, we're not quite there yet, but give it a decade or two, and we will have cracked this problem technically. Whether it will be implemented in the economy is a different story. That has a lot to do with relative prices, a lot to do with market power, and so on and so forth. But technically, we're almost there.